You know what they say, you should always write what you know.
Well, if that were true, this show would have ended years ago.
Antisocial as that point may be, it is a good one. The advice to write what you know, like so much of modern writing orthodoxy, is a troubled truism at best. Really, it sounds like one of those rules that comes from a teacher being annoyed at something and then issuing a blanket ban on it, rather than teaching their students the more nuanced reality. You can't use you and I in your papers, say may I rather than can I, and only write what you know. But I think the real issue with write what you know is not that you just shouldn't write about certain things. Instead, as with all things rhetorical, it comes back to your audience and the risk of losing readers when you're not sufficiently in control of your subject matter. For example, I've taught many young writers who set out to write starry-eyed romances even though they haven't had any real experiences with deep romantic relationships. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to write romance, write romance. But the problem comes from the fact that these inexperienced writers then have a tendency to craft these apparently idealized romantic relationships that actually portray some deeply damaging and unhealthy behaviors. And sure, people are complex and stuff is messy, but a reader expecting a harmless romance will probably give up on a story that ends up unwittingly celebrating toxic behaviors. And it is clear from it all that these writers are just writing from a place of inexperience. They've maybe grown up on certain depictions of things from TV and movies that they reproduce in their stories without knowing that they're far more problematic than praiseworthy. And my response as a reader is not, oh, this writer sure is an ignorant dummy who wrote what they didn't know. My response is, oh, this story is celebrating things that I'm not comfortable with. Things that maybe more experienced readers and writers would know are warning signs and not romantic gestures. The piece, in other words, isn't meeting my expectations in the way that I want it to, so I stop reading. You may have heard people talk about a reader's suspension of disbelief, or their willingness to accept things that are obviously untrue, as long as they fit within the rules of the story being told. We can, for example, suspend our disbelief in a world where dragons fly around on spaceships and just accept the story on its own terms. We're along for the ride so long as the story remains believably and reliably grounded in its own rules. But you can do things that might disrupt a reader's suspension of disbelief or their willingness to go along for the ride. Suddenly, those spacefaring dragons don't need spacesuits, and for no apparent reason, well, your readers might wonder why the rules suddenly changed, and then they might give up on the story at that point. But even when you aren't writing fiction, you can still consider your readers' willingness to go along for the ride. We might not call it suspension of disbelief for nonfiction or poetry, but you can still write an essay about life in Vietnam with enough inconsistencies or inaccuracies that your reader just isn't willing to stick with it, for example. In other words, when you write what you don't know, your writing will likely be less believable, less reliable, and your readers will be less likely to stick around for the ride. The writing isn't in your control, and readers will consequently feel less secure in your hands. So when we say that you should write what you know, I think what we really mean is that you should know what you're writing about, at least well enough that you can write something believable and reliable. Something that won't give your readers reasons to check out because the basic facts of your piece got away from you. But it's important, first of all, to remember that you only need to know enough to write something convincing enough to get your reader to keep reading, and second, to remember that you don't need to know it all from the start. There are, in fact, a few things that you can do along the way to make sure that you're writing something that your readers will be willing to go along with. Now, one of the great genres of the writing world is the research paper. It's a genre that begins in not knowing something. So if write what you know were actually binding law,
then the show wouldn't exist.
Yeah, you keep saying that, but no, if write what you know were the law, then there wouldn't be any research papers because nobody would be allowed to take on a project that started with a question rather than an answer. And now this is the hardest question I'll ask all day, but how do the writers of research papers address their lack of knowledge? By doing research, of course. So a reasonable place to start when you're writing something you don't know is with research. Just start learning stuff and see where that takes you. For example, I read Rita Dove's book, Sonata Melodica, when I was in poetry school, and I think it's probably safe to say that Rita Dove doesn't have a lot of primary experience being a violinist living in Europe around the turn of the 18th century and hanging out with Beethoven. But the book exists, and it received some critical acclaim too. Of course, some historical research went into Dove's work on the book. Write what you know didn't stop her from getting started. But in the spirit of that rule, she no doubt had to make sure that she did know enough about the history before she went to print. So it makes a lot of sense that research would be a part of your process too. Maybe you're writing fiction that takes place in a time and location far away from your own experience. That's fine, but do some work to learn what things were like then. You don't want a reader jumping ship because you asked them to believe in a version of 1980s Rome where they ate cronuts and took selfies. And what that research looks like can and will vary from project to project. If you're doing something academic or technical, your research will probably be more formalized and methodical. If you're doing something in what we call the creative genres, your research may look a little different. In fact, one of the running jokes we had in grad school was that research for us poets began and ended on Wikipedia. Maybe you look at old-fashioned magazines or listen to historical music, or you might read up on just how much thrust a dragon would need to generate to launch a rocket into space. Now, these may not be things you know from the start, but that doesn't mean those topics are off limits. Do some research and learn what you need to know. Rita Dove did historical research, but that book also has a generous dose of imagination. But again, Dove did enough research to give the book enough historical validity that readers are willing to go along with the more imaginative elements of the book as well. And you might be wondering when your project is researched enough, and to that, I can only say that it depends. But these other suggestions might help you find the sweet spot for yourself. I really admire the work of the poet Kay Ryan, and at one point at least, she said that her poetry develops the way an oyster does, with an aggravation. Something apparently gets stuck in her head, and layer by layer, a poem forms around it the way a pearl forms around an irritating grain of sand. It's a good illustration of the way that you might not know what you're writing until you've written it. As I understand it, Kay Ryan seems to be saying that you might get some little grain of an initial idea, something that interests you or bothers you or otherwise begs you to write about it, but you may not know exactly why or exactly what you have to say about it yet. Maybe you're writing a poem about the branches on the sidewalk after the trees had been pruned. There's something there, but you only really discover that it's a poem about your anxieties about getting older in the process of writing it. Maybe you set out to write an essay about the history of fast food mascots, only to discover near the end that you're really writing about your parents' divorce. Or maybe you're writing a story about a genius who can't get anything done, only to find out that you focused in on the wrong character and that you really want to write that story. When we're trained to write book reports or lab reports or any other kind of report, we might get the idea that writing is what you do after you've done the learning. But lots of writers know that some of the most consequential learning happens in the act of writing. Writing isn't just a way to report on the knowledge you have, it's a way to discover new knowledge. So another drawback of taking write what you know too seriously is that you might end up over-determining your work from the start and writing without the flexibility to discover unexpected insights or connections along the way. At the very least, though, you may have some ideas, but it's only through working through them that you can actually figure out or know what they really are. If I had a nickel for every time I read a student's story that finally landed somewhere interesting in the last paragraph, or for every argument paper that didn't really find its thesis until the very end, I'd probably have several dollars worth of nickels. The point is that those students, and so many of us, don't really know what we're doing until we start doing it. Write what you know isn't helpful advice at all if it means you have to know everything from the start, because you couldn't possibly know what you're writing until after you've gotten started. And this show has been mentioned more than a couple of times as an example today.
For good reason, bud.
Maybe so, but I think it's worth mentioning because this show has shifted and evolved over time as I figured out more and more what I want it to be. And it's far from finished, but it's also far from where it was. You can't start a project in its final form, but you can start a project in its current form and iterate on it from there. So you may not be writing what you know at first, but you will be writing what you know by the time you finish. And of course, you may think you're writing what you know, but you're still working on understanding where and when your readers will opt out. So it's never a bad idea to get some input from an actual reader. I wrote a poem in school once that took place in late spring, and I had a clear image in my head of flowers that I had seen that day. But I cannot write about flowers if I must only write what I know, so I did my best poet's research to track down flowers that looked like the ones I had seen, and I wrote a poem that featured them prominently. Until in the workshop, one of the other poets informed me that mums don't bloom in that time of year. I had named the wrong flower at the wrong time of year and lost all the readers who did actually know about that kind of thing. But I couldn't have known that, or at least likely would never have known that, if not for the helpful intel from an actual reader. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, so it's always good to get an outside opinion. In fact, if you haven't checked out the friendly little Writing with Andrew Discord server, that can be a great way to get a second pair of eyes on your project. Not long ago, we were having a conversation about the idea of writing what you know. So I guess it would be fair to say that today's show is brought to you by the folks on Discord. It's a pretty low-key space, but there are some good things going on there. In the end, the main idea is this, though. You don't have to know things to start writing about them. But you do have a responsibility to know enough by the end of a project that your readers will be willing to go along for the ride. The idea of write what you know puts up too many needless barriers to getting started, so it might be better to say, know what you write. You can write about anything you want to write about, so long as you eventually know enough about it to create a believable and reliable piece. Or at the very least, you don't have to write what you know, but you had better know it by the time you publish it. Whether you're doing research, figuring out the heart of your piece as you go, or getting some help from an outside reader, you've got plenty of time and help available to you to know what you need to know by the time you finish a project. And when you do that, you'll be writing things that your audience will be more willing to stick around for because you won't have those obvious breaking points that come with a lack of knowledge. But it's one thing to give you permission to write what you don't know, and another thing entirely to force you to give it a try. I once took a fiction writing class where the teacher prompted us to write a story that takes place somewhere we had never been. So I chose to write a story that took place entirely in the cockpit of an airplane. Of course, it required a lot of research. I even found like a virtual tour of a specific plane's cockpit online so that I could talk about where all the altimeters and warning lights and other things were. It was a story that was fun to write, but honestly, it was even more fun to learn what I needed to know in order to tell that story in a believable way. It's a prompt that I've since passed along to students to good effect, and that I want to pass along to you today. As we wrap up this video on writing what you know, I want to invite you to write something that you don't know. To write a story that takes place somewhere you've never been. Now, of course, don't just write this story in a suburb of Illinois that is practically indistinguishable from any old suburb anywhere. Write a story where the setting plays a key part in what happens. Do the research, figure it out as you go, and maybe share it on Discord to find out where what you don't know is causing problems. Remember, in writing, and pretty much in everything else too, you don't need to know everything to do a good job. You just need to know enough. Do that, and you'll be writing things you might never have thought possible if you've only lived by write what you know. Or maybe you'll write some highly refined garbage and learn an unmistakable lesson in why write what you know is a great rule to follow. But I don't know, I kind of think you might just find that writing what you know isn't as restrictive as we sometimes make it out to be. So give it a shot, and let's meet again next week to see how it went. Thanks for spending this time with me, and we'll see you then.